let's just sort of jump right into it. Okay, Eric. So a previous guest on my show has said, sort of jokingly, that the difference between a leftist and a liberal is that a leftist will come on a show like the Soapbox, which I thought was sort of a good line. But I'm not sure I'm totally clear on the distinctions between those terms. I think labels are only useful up to an extent, but to the extent that it's useful to use a term like liberal, what exactly does that mean in America today?
Well, to be a liberal today in America is to be the furthest left a person can be in terms of labels and still have a voice in the mainstream discourse and still expect to accomplish anything and still have a notion of pragmatic, practical politics behind their actions, rather than having a vision of a future society that someday might come into being, although it's hard to say exactly how.
So is that to say that in terms of how you see leftists, that they are too idealistic, they're unrealistic in terms
I'm a leftist.
You are? Okay.
I'm a leftist liberal.
Okay.
I am as liberal as I can be in most cases. In some areas, I'm actually conservative. But I'm a conservative liberal, and I'm a leftist liberal.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I think I'm both is that I believe myself to be as far to the left as you can be and still be a pragmatist.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. So what practically speaking does that mean? How far left can you go and still be
it's not a question of how far left you can go. Here's the test I give every argument I have with people on my left.
Mm-hmm.
Show me how you're going to get from here to there. In other words, I agree all kinds of things are terrible in our society, and it would be better to fix them in radical fashion.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can't show me how you can move your vision forward so that it can become reality, number one, and number two, how you can improve things along the way so that all the work doesn't go to waste if you fail, which you most likely will, then I don't really have any interest in what you're doing. I was speaking for one of my books at a bookstore in Washington, Politics and Prose, and somebody from the audience said, you're bad because you don't support impeaching Bush, and Bush deserves to be impeached. And I said, I agree Bush deserves to be impeached, but he's not going to be impeached by this Congress. It's impossible to imagine. And if you put a lot of effort into doing something that won't happen and leave nothing in its wake, you're just jerking off. It's all masturbatory self-aggrandizement,
mm-hmm.
self-congratulation. So I feel there's much too much of that among leftists, among progressives.
Mm-hmm.
There's too little practical thinking, too little institution building, and much too much self-congratulation. It's easy to point out what's wrong with our society. There is so much wrong with our society. But actually improving it, actually helping the people who need help, there's not that much of that. That's why I consider myself to be a liberal rather than something else.
Okay. Now, on the cover of your book, Why We're Liberals, a handbook for post-Bush, a political handbook for post-Bush America, there are a number of sort of prominent liberal historical figures, arguably liberal. Among them, you include Albert Einstein, who is a self-described socialist. You've got radical revolutionaries like Thomas Paine. You've got someone like Martin Luther King Jr., who, by the time of his death, was flirting with socialism.
You can be a socialist liberal.
Okay.
You can be a liberal socialist. Dissent magazine has a history of liberal socialism, which is, and again, communists sometimes disingenuously, sometimes not, depending on who's doing the talking, used to call themselves liberals in a hurry. But
Mm-hmm.
that's not true, because communism, as we understand it in the real world, was anti-democratic. To be a democratic socialist is not very different than being a leftist liberal.
Right.
The idea is basically Sweden or Finland. Finland
Mm-hmm.
is actually my favorite country when it comes to politics. But the question is, how do you get there? So I think Martin Luther King and Tom Paine is a long time ago. would have loved to have lived in a country like Sweden, where everybody gets health care and everybody gets free education. And in Finland, they don't even have anything. They don't have private education at all. Everyone goes to public schools in the whole country, and you can go to school for your entire life if you want. You can get a PhD, and then you can get an MD, and then you can get a JD, and then you can get another PhD, and the state will support you. And there's very little, in this country, as I'm sure you know, the average CEO of a Fortune 500 company makes approximately 400 times what the average worker makes, and in those countries it's 20 or 30. That's the entire differential. So I'd love to live in a society like that. There are a lot of reasons our society isn't like that, but if what you say is this country sucks because of how unequal it is, I would say, well, what are you doing to make it more equal, to give people on the bottom a better chance? I give you an example. Bill de Blasio, he doesn't call himself a liberal, he calls himself a progressive. I've just written an e-book about him that the Nation published. He's using the power of New York City government to attack inequality in New York City. Now, he's not going to actually change what's called the Gini coefficient, which is how how economists measure inequality in New York City. It's too big. New York City is too big, and the forces behind inequality are too big. But he is going to help a lot of people with universal pre-K, with an increase in the number of affordable apartments, with free Wi-Fi, with paid sick leave, et cetera, et cetera. If you tell me that leftists are not interested in these things because the system is so screwed up, and these kinds of steps are just shoring up a bad system, I'm going to say, well, that's ridiculous. That's a fantasy. So it doesn't seem to me, to support those kinds of things, it doesn't matter if you call yourself a socialist or a liberal or a leftist. But the only kind of progress we make in this country is incremental progress. We're not going to have a revolution, and I'm glad we're not, because I don't trust revolutionaries. So to me, the test is purely pragmatic. And I could be wrong. Sometimes it turns out occasionally in history there are moments of great change, and someone like me will probably fail to see them. But I think much more likely is the idea that you think you're working for great change, and what you're doing is just, jerking off.
Well, I wonder what you would think of, as you know, I'm sure at the time of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, he was very vocally critical of the government, which he saw as imperialist, and he came out against the Vietnam War in such a way that he became sort of a pariah even within his own community to a certain extent. Do you feel that he was sort of engaging in sort of masturbatory activism at that point, or was he?
No, he was Martin Luther King. He was the leader of a great movement. He was doing his best to bring millions of people along with him, and he was a visionary. He was presenting a vision, just as he did in the 1950s. Although he's kind of young for that, but just as the leaders of the civil rights movement did in the 1950s when no one was paying attention, and then 10 years later it became the central political issue of our time. He had a vision of how he would achieve progress, and he was killed before we would ever find out if it was successful. But, there was a strong anti-war movement, and he was joining it. He wasn't just saying, I'm taking my marbles home if you don't play along with me. He was saying, I've ignored this issue for too long. I did it for pragmatic reasons, but I now see that the pragmatism was a mistake, and I'm going to be pragmatic in a different way.
So do you think someone like, say, Cornel West, more contemporary figure, who has been sort of in the news lately and criticized by some liberals, is he sort of doing that? Is he saying, I'm going to take my... He was
criticized by some liberals. He was criticized by a fellow black intellectual who had been his mentee.
Okay.
Michael Eric Dyson.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't criticized for not being liberal. He was criticized for not being sufficiently scholarly in his past 20 years, for paying attention only to what Dyson treats as rabble-rousing rather than to being doing the kind of scholarly intellectual work that Cornel did in his early years. I mean, it's a lot of issues in that article, including Dyson is kind of a lover scorned in it, and a lot of it is about Cornel's personality, where he's attacking black spokesmen and leaders who he thinks are too close to Obama. But the issue there is not that he's a radical rather than a liberal. It's that he's been. The argument is that he's become infatuated with his own celebrity, and we can talk about that if you want. But it's a separate issue than the one we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I don't know that we necessarily need to go there unless it is integral to this question. But I'm curious what you think about the substance of what he said. I think he clearly is open, as is anyone, to criticism about his style. But what about the substance of his critique of the Obama presidency? Is that fair game?
Yeah. Okay. I've long admired and in some way loved Cornel. I knew him many years ago when he was getting arrested for anti-apartheid demonstrations at Yale, and he was a professor at the divinity school there, and I was a graduate student. This is 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I've never met anyone in my life half as eloquent as Cornel, and also inspirational. Mm. He's an amazing person. He has superhuman powers of eloquence, and also of recall in terms of how erudite he is. The question of I don't agree with his attacks on Obama because I don't think playing the race card in this country is a winner. In other words, blacks are 12% of the population, slightly smaller than Latinos. And they can't expect to have majority support for things that are pitched just at blacks. Now, I'm a little divided about this. I used to argue until very recently, until actually my very last Nation column, that we should try to ignore race as much as we can in this country and focus on class, because race divides people and class unites them. Mm-hmm. And like if you look at Sweden and Finland and Norway and you say, why are they so successful? The first answer you get is, well, they're such a homogenous culture. Mm-hmm. They don't have the divisions that we have. And now that they're being challenged by Islamic immigration, they're losing some of that ability to deal with these problems. But in my last column in The Nation, I said, institutional racism turns out to be such a powerful force in this country that it's really unfair to ask people to ignore it when it's ruining their lives, and they so self-identify this way. So, like I said, I'm a little divided on this question because I understand why people identify by race, particularly African Americans, and how it's unavoidable and how they're persecuted by race, on the one hand. On the other hand, arguments like Cornell's that Barack Obama should have announced his presidency at a meeting of, what's that guy's name, the radio host?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
The guy that, the black radio host.
Tavis Smiley.
Tavis Smiley's meeting for black leaders, rather than, outside the Illinois State Legislature where Abraham Lincoln announced his president. That's just crazy. If you want to be president of the United States, you can't be viewed as the leader of black America. That was Jesse Jackson's problem, and he was never taken seriously as a result. So Cornel is not, he's not giving pragmatic political advice to Barack Obama. He's speaking as he understands himself to be a prophet and a visionary on behalf of a small group of the downtrodden. When I say small, I mean by percentage of Americans, which is 12%. It's not a political winner, and Obama would be crazy to take his advice. What I guess if I were to be critical of Cornel in this context, I would say he shouldn't personalize it so much. Obama's, he's not capable of seeing all the different pressures that Obama feels in that office, and his personal attacks on Obama are strike one more sound more like peak than considered analysis. So I share that part of the critique, that Cornel is making a big mistake with his very personal criticism of Obama and of Obama supporters, even though I don't actually count myself among those people. I've become quite critical of Obama.
So when he sort of criticizes Obama's use of drones, and he criticizes his perceived capitulation to Wall Street, I mean, these are outside the bounds of race criticism, aren't they?
Yeah, but what does Cornel know about anti-terrorism policy? And maybe he does, but my question is always this: what is your alternative? What is your alternative? Now, if in terms of drones, I don't like the drones. You know, they're very objectionable in many ways. But again, what is your alternative? If your alternative is what presidents have done in the past, which is either bombing or an invasion, then drones are preferable if those are the only options. If there are other options, well, you have to tell me how you get from here to there.
But isn't that a debate we need to have as a country, as a democracy? Because
there's a million of those debates we need to have as a country and as a democracy. And guess what? This country is incapable of having debates. We can't even get the Republicans to agree that science is real.
So then,
I mean, I think to the degree that I sympathize with Obama, I also wrote a book about this, a short book called Kabuki Democracy, about our inability to have debates and the fundamental flaws of our system, which I published after Obama's first year. The sympathetic way to treat Obama is to say, look, the system can only handle one thing at a time. And Obama made his choice. His choice was, A, to save the economy. That was a pretty good choice, even though maybe he could have done a better job on inequality when he did it. And B, to pass Obamacare, an enormous achievement for all its flaws. And then by the time he turned to other things, it was too late because he lost his working majority in Congress. You can disagree with those choices, but they're reasonable and they're defensible. Some of the things he did are not. Some of the things were just come out in Barney Frank's memoir that he did with regard to the Consumer Finance Agency. It's not nearly as strong as it could have been or should be. But look, the system is very powerful. It eats up progressives all the time, and you have to deal with that fact. It's not the alternative. You know, it's not like Ralph Nader is going to be president. It's not like the alternative to Hillary Clinton is Noam Chomsky. You know, the alternative is going to be Walker or Rubio or Bush. So, unless you can show me how your alternative is going to bring about a better outcome in a time frame that, you know, is part of my lifetime, I'm not interested. And that, to me, is the fundamental difference. Now, you can say we should debate drones. Well, we should, shouldn't we? We should also debate the fact with Guantanamo. We should debate our entire Middle East policy. We should debate our housing policy. We should debate, I could go on all day. Mm-hmm. You know, they're all screwed up in fundamental ways. What about police? What about the way the police treat minority communities and poor communities? It's shocking. Mm-hmm. It's horrific. That's the thing I'm upset about this morning. Mm-hmm. And yet, just complaining about them and condemning them doesn't really help. You need to present alternatives.
So what about this argument? You know, Ellen Schrecker wrote this great book, Many Are the Crimes, about McCarthyism in America.
Yes, I used it in my book, When Presidents Lie, my dissertation book on the history of presidential deception.
Oh, good. I'm afraid I haven't read that book, but you know, that's a pretty stark time in America, and I wonder if at that time, if that era isn't responsible for the hard rightward shift in politics in America, because if you sort of amputate that left wing of politics and political debate in the country, whatever you might think about socialists and communists and whether or not you sympathize or agree with them, didn't they serve as an important sort of counterbalance to the hard right in America? And so by severing them, now what had previously been sort of moderate, slightly left-leaning is now ultra-leftist. Like, I mean, like the accusation that Obama is a socialist, which is sort of absurd. But don't we need some of those people, I guess is what I'm asking, some of those people who are going to dig their heels in the sand and be somewhat intransigent and unrealistic, but don't we need them to help sort of pull the debate in a more reasonable direction?
In theory, we do. The Nation asked me for the 150th issue to write an article called Why Liberals Need Radicals. And I wrote it, and it was rejected. I published a version of it in the journal Democracy. And the reason it was rejected is because whereas I believe it in theory, and I believe what you're saying in theory, I don't actually see it working very well in practice. I agree with everything you just said about the 1950s until I look deeply into who were the communists and what were they saying and doing in the 1940s and 50s, and I see that they were very corrupt and dishonest. The leadership of the party was anyway. There were a lot of honest, well-meaning people in the party whose values and commitments were manipulated by people who were liars and in some cases spies, and were living on Moscow money. And believe me, let's not forget how awful the Soviet Union was. That Stalin is a more successful mass murderer than Hitler was, second probably only to Mao, another communist beacon of that period. So I have a great deal of affection for the old Socialist Party, and particularly also for the sort of democratic socialist movement led by Michael Harrington, and before him, what's his name?
Eugene Debs?
No, after Debs, the guy whose grandson was an editor of Newsweek and wrote those books with Walter Isaacson.
I'm not sure.
Anyway, I have a great deal of affection for those people, and particularly their working with the American working class and the labor unions, people like Walter Reuther, etc. But today, I have a lot of trouble finding radicals that I feel are serious. Like I said, there's a ton wrong with our society. But I need criticism. Basically, I need constructive criticism, and I need programs that don't need to be 100% successful to succeed. I mean, look at Ralph Nader, right? He was not 100% successful. He was, in fact, 2% successful, and he succeeded in bringing the election close enough for George Bush to steal it. If he hadn't been in the race, Al Gore would be president, and there'd be no Iraq invasion, and there'd be a lot of things that would have made this a much better country. I didn't like Al Gore back then at all, but again, the choice was not between who I liked and who I didn't like. It was who was going to help the people who needed help most in this country, and Nader turned out to be their enemy. And now a big part of that is the fact that we have a winner-take-all election system, but it was also the fact that the people who supported him were not serious about politics. They were using politics as a kind of fashion statement, as an identity, as an expression of their identity, rather than as a means of compromising and cooperating with a lot of people with whom you don't agree on many things in order to advance the causes and values in which you believe.
Well, I voted for Gore, and I briefly entertained the idea of voting for Nader, and I decided not to, but I think I might now, and I think my reasoning would be that it would be as a protest vote, which I suspect you would object to, but because I feel like, say for example, Hillary Clinton, who has had Secret Service for 21 plus years or whatever, and she's claiming to be this person of the people. I mean, forgive me for being skeptical, but I have a hard time believing that she is going to. I believed in Obama. I voted for him, and I just speaking personally, I feel no appreciable difference down here on the bottom. Whereas I know from reports, Ron Suskind wrote this great book, Confidence Men, and in it he describes a meeting, where the bankers were basically on their knees at the time of the height of the fiscal crisis. And Obama, rather than extract some concessions from them, reassured them, and said, don't worry, I'm going to keep the pitchforks at bay. That kind of betrayal, should I not expect the same thing from Hillary Clinton?
Well, I mean, I think you're overstating it somewhat, but that's the kind of thing that I was referring to when I said I was disappointed with some of the things that have come out in terms of how easy he went on the banks when he didn't need to. But listen, I would say to you, you fundamentally misunderstand what politics is about. It doesn't matter if you feel betrayed. Any politician will betray you. That's the nature of politics in a political system where money counts more than votes, more than people. And you're going to say, well, then the system needs to be changed. And I would agree with that. So I'm going to say, how are you going to change the system? What are you doing to change the system? If all you're saying is I'm not going to vote for the guy who clearly is going to be much better for the poor and for immigrants and for single mothers and for education than the other guy, who probably will get us into a war, then I'm going to say then you're just not serious. You're just not serious about politics. That's not what politics is.
Let me turn the question back on you. You recognize that the system needs some changing. What would you do? What would you have the rest of us do who are frustrated down here? What would you have us do to bring about the systemic change that we need?
Well, I think the most important thing we can do is try to find ways to reduce the power of money in our system. Nothing much can happen until we do that. And it's very complicated because of the way the Supreme Court is interpreting the Constitution right now, but there are a lot of ways to do it. One way not to do it is a constitutional amendment, because it's not going to happen. Politicians are not going to agree to that because they're gaming the system the way it is. So if you tell me that you're starting a campaign to have a constitutional amendment to get money out of politics, I'm going to say you're not serious. First of all, you can't get money entirely out of politics. It's very complicated. But there are a lot of things you can do to make it less worse and to improve the chances of people who are running. Again, in New York City, we just elected one of the most progressive politicians in America because we have a system that gives you 6-to-1 matching, $6 for every dollar you raise. So it allows you to raise little amounts of money from in small donations. It only applies to small donations. And it helps you meet the power of the big donors. Now, that would be a great national law to have. That would be a great even state law to have. There are things that can be done. I'd say that's number one. Number two, I'm really worried about climate change. And, I'm not a scientist, but I think that's the biggest threat we face aside from money. And it's related to money. So I don't think we can actually do anything about climate change until we do something about money. So I would look to that area first. I do it through critiquing the press and showing how the press misportrays and helps people to misperceive fundamental problems. And I think that these two issues, the fact that the press is unwilling to call out how radical and untethered to reality Republicans have grown, and the way we let money dominate our political system. I think those two, without solving those two fundamental problems, you can't solve really any of the other problems, except on a local level. And in a local level, you can't solve them. You can just ameliorate them. So that's the way I think about the world, and that's where I put my efforts into, such as they are. And I may be wrong. Like I said, the critique I make of myself is that I would have had a lot of sympathy for the Kennedys saying to Martin Luther King, maybe it's not the best time to have a march. They would have been wrong. It was the best time to have a march, and they didn't see it. So if there is going to be a revolution like there was in Eastern Europe in 1989, I would be unprepared for it. But most of the time, there aren't revolutions, and most of the time, these revolutions don't turn out very well. So I'm willing to make that mistake, and I wish radicals would pay more attention to the pragmatic problems with their critiques. We need good radical critiques, but we need radical critiques that lead to pragmatic action, and very few radicals are interested in that.
Is there anyone out there right now that you think is offering good radical critiques?
Well, let's see. I was surprised at how much I ended up liking Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay in the Atlantic about reparations, which I thought was a crazy thing to do, but it ended up having lots of educational points about ways to move forward in the absence of actual reparations, which, as he admitted, will never happen in this universe. Mm. I very much liked the way Zephyr Teachout ran for governor of New York, challenging Andrew Cuomo in ways that made it impossible for him actually ever to be president, and forced a lot of issues onto the public agenda. I had a great deal of sympathy for Occupy Wall Street in terms of bringing the issue to the fore of inequality. I don't think we'd be talking about the 1% without them, and I don't think we'd be having the kinds of policy proposals that we're getting without them. I probably wouldn't have written this little book I wrote about de Blasio without them. They certainly helped educate me, or helped me, inspire me to educate myself. So there have been some useful interventions, but by and large, it seems to me that the radical posture in the United States, what I read in The Nation and elsewhere, is not interested in pragmatic change. It's interested in moral superiority, and that's where I become. I consider myself to be the most conservative person at The Nation, and it's not because I want to live in a more conservative type world. It's because I want to get things done. I believe the word moral victory is another term for the word loss, and I don't think many people on the left of me agree with that, and that's where our fundamental divide lies.